You think you know what respect looks like? Wait until you hear what this old man did to the people who thought he was nobody. Solomon Gray sat at the end of a long table surrounded by people in expensive suits. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody looked at him. But when he stood up at the end of that dinner, every single person in that room lost something they could never get back. And the one person who had shown him kindness, that person's life changed forever. Hello and welcome. If this is your first time here, please subscribe. If you've been with us before, thank you for coming back. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Miami, Cape Town, maybe Port of Spain or Birmingham? We want to hear from you. Now let me tell you about Solomon. Solomon James Gray was 68 years old. He was not a big man, 5'7", maybe 5'8" on a good day. He had a thin frame, narrow shoulders, and a face full of deep lines that made him look like a man who had spent his whole life thinking hard about things other people didn't bother to think about at all. His skin was the color of dark honey, weathered from years of standing on construction sites in the sun, and his hair was white, not silver, not gray, but white, like fresh cotton, cut close to his head. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow from a beam that fell on him when he was 26 years old, back when he was still carrying lumber instead of signing contracts. He wore glasses with thin gold frames that he was always pushing up the bridge of his nose with one finger, a habit so constant that he had a little callus on the side of his nose from it. And here is the thing about Solomon that most people never would have guessed. This quiet, thin, unassuming man with the gold glasses and the cotton white hair was worth $47 million. He owned Gray & Sons Construction, one of the largest black-owned construction companies in the Southeast. He had built hospitals, schools, office buildings, churches, housing developments. His company employed over 300 people across 4 states. He had shaken hands with governors and senators. He had been on the cover of business magazines. But if you saw Solomon Gray walking down the street on any given Tuesday, you would not have known any of that. Because Solomon dressed the way he had always dressed. Plain dark trousers, a simple button-down shirt, usually white or light blue, and brown leather shoes that he polished himself every Sunday night. No watch. No rings except his wedding band, which he still wore even though his wife, Nadine, had been gone for 4 years now. No flash. No show. Nothing on the outside that told you what was on the inside. He lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina. Not a mansion. Not even a big house. A 3-bedroom brick home with a front porch and a magnolia tree in the yard that Nadine had planted the year they moved in, 32 years ago. The inside of the house smelled like lemon wood polish and old books, because Solomon had bookshelves in every room. The living room, the bedroom, even the hallway. He read history mostly. Biographies of people who built things from nothing. He liked those stories because they reminded him of his own. Solomon had grown up poor in a small town outside of Macon, Georgia. His father drove a delivery truck. His mother cleaned houses for white families on the other side of town. They lived in a 2-room house with a tin roof that leaked when it rained, and Solomon remembered lying in bed as a boy listening to the ping, ping, ping of water dripping into the bucket his mother set on the floor. He remembered the smell of that house. Wood smoke and fried cornbread, and the sharp, clean scent of the bleach his mother used when she came home from work, her hands raw and red from scrubbing other people's floors. He started working construction at 17. The first day on the job, a foreman handed him a wheelbarrow full of wet cement and said, "Move that." No instructions, no training, just move that. Solomon moved it. His arms burned, his back screamed. The sun pressed down on him like a hot iron. At the end of the day, his hands were covered in blisters the size of dimes, and his shirt was soaked through with sweat and dust. He went home, sat on his mother's porch, and she looked at his hands and said nothing. She just went inside, came back with a basin of warm water and a bar of soap, and washed his hands for him. Gently. The way she washed everything. Other people's dishes, other people's floors. Now her son's broken hands. She dried them with a towel and said, "Tomorrow they'll hurt less." And she was right. He kept going, carrying bricks, mixing cement, hauling lumber in the Georgia heat until his back ached so bad some nights he couldn't sleep and had to stand at the kitchen counter because lying down made it worse. He saved every dollar he didn't need for food. He ate beans and rice 5 days a week. He wore the same 3 shirts until the collars frayed. He didn't go out with friends on Friday nights. He didn't buy anything he didn't need. Every dollar that didn't go to food or rent went into a coffee can under his bed. By 25, he had saved enough to buy his own truck, a beat-up Ford with a rusted tailgate, and hire 2 workers. By 30, he had a small company with 8 employees and a reputation for showing up on time and doing honest work. By 40, the company had grown to 50 employees and was building schools in 3 counties. By 50, it was an empire.
And he did it all without ever raising his voice, without ever cheating a client, without ever cutting a corner, without ever forgetting where he came from.
That was the thing about Solomon. He remembered the tin roof. He remembered the bucket on the floor. He remembered his mother's red, cracked hands. He remembered the blisters and the beans and the coffee can under the bed. And he carried those memories with him into every boardroom and every negotiation and every handshake, like a compass that always pointed toward the truth. There was one more thing about Solomon that mattered. Every single Friday afternoon, no matter how busy he was, no matter what deal was on the table, Solomon left the office at 3 o'clock and drove to a grocery store. He filled 2 paper bags with food: rice, bread, canned vegetables, chicken, fruit, soap, toothpaste. And he drove to a different neighborhood each week and gave those bags to someone who needed them. He never told anyone. He never put the company's name on the bags. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because his mother had once gone 3 days without eating so that he could eat, and he swore on her memory that he would never let a day pass without feeding someone. Nadine was the only person who knew about the Friday bags. She used to help him pack them. After she died, Ruth took over. Every Friday at 2:45, Ruth had 2 bags packed and sitting in the trunk of Solomon's car. She never said a word about it. She didn't need to. Nadine had been his anchor. She was a school teacher, 4th grade, and she had a laugh that sounded like music playing in another room, warm and far away and beautiful. She kept Solomon humble. Whenever he came home from closing a big deal, puffed up and proud, she'd look at him over her reading glasses and say, "That's wonderful, Sol. Now take out the trash." He loved her for that. He loved her for 1,000 things, but he loved her most for never letting him become someone he wasn't. When Nadine died, a stroke, sudden, in the middle of making breakfast on a Saturday morning, she was scrambling eggs and she just fell, the spatula still in her hand. Solomon nearly folded. He sat in that house for 3 months and barely spoke. He stopped going to the office. He stopped reading. He stopped polishing his shoes. The magnolia tree in the front yard bloomed, and he didn't even notice. His secretary, a woman named Ruth who had worked for him for 21 years, came by every other day with food he didn't eat and mail he didn't open. She'd sit with him for an hour, not saying much, just being there. Ruth was 60 years old, small and round with a no-nonsense face and a heart as big as a barn. She had been with Solomon since the company had 12 employees and a single office above a hardware store. She knew him better than almost anyone. But what happened next changed everything. 4 years after Nadine's death, Solomon was 68 and thinking about the future. Not his own future, the company's future. Gray & Sons needed a successor. Someone to take over when Solomon stepped back. Someone who understood not just construction, but people. Someone who could lead with integrity, not ego. Someone who remembered, or at least understood, what it was like to have nothing. Solomon had a board of directors, 7 people. Most of them were sharp, competent, and ambitious. But ambition and character are not the same thing, and Solomon knew that better than anybody. He had watched too many good companies get destroyed by leaders who were smart but selfish, talented but cruel. He didn't want that for his company. He didn't want that for his 300 employees and their families who depended on Gray & Sons for their livelihoods. So Solomon came up with a plan, a test. And can you believe what this man did? He decided he was going to sit at his own table, at his own company dinner, and pretend to be nobody. He wanted to see how the people around him, the people who wanted his job, his power, his legacy, treated a person who had nothing to offer them. Now here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Solomon called Ruth into his office on a Monday morning. Ruth came in with her coffee mug that said, "World's okayest secretary," a gift from Solomon that she had kept for 15 years, and sat down across from his desk. "Ruth, I need you to do something for me," Solomon said. "If it involves me learning how to use that new computer system, the answer is no." Solomon smiled. He had a quiet smile, the kind that barely moved his mouth but lit up his eyes behind those gold glasses. "I want to hold a dinner, Friday night, at the Morrison downtown. I want all 7 board members there, plus their guests. I want it formal, black tie, the works." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "You hate formal dinners." "I do, but that's the point. I want to see something, and I need you to introduce me to the table as someone else." Ruth set down her coffee mug. "I beg your pardon?" Solomon explained his plan. He would attend his own dinner, but not as Solomon Gray, CEO. He would arrive late, dressed simply, and Ruth would introduce him as Mr. William Porter, an old friend of the company, a retired contractor, nobody important. He would sit at the end of the table, say very little, and watch. He wanted to see who these people really were when they thought nobody powerful was looking. Ruth stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Solomon Gray, you are either the wisest man I've ever met or the craziest." "Probably both," he said. Ruth agreed to help. She always did. But Solomon had no idea what was coming. The dinner was held on a Friday evening in November at the Morrison, a fine restaurant downtown with white tablecloths and tall candles and a chandelier that looked like frozen rain. The table was long, 12 seats, and it was set with the kind of glasses and silverware that most people only see in movies. The 7 board members arrived in their best clothes, dark suits, silk ties, expensive watches. Their wives and husbands beside them, dressed just as sharp. At the head of the table sat an empty chair, Solomon's chair, or so everyone assumed. Ruth had told them that Mr. Gray would be arriving later due to a prior engagement. In the meantime, she said, an old friend of the company would be joining them, a Mr. William Porter, a retired contractor. Please make him feel welcome. At 7:15, Solomon walked in. He was wearing dark trousers, a plain white shirt, no tie, and his brown leather shoes. His gold glasses, his white hair. No watch. No ring except Nadine's band. He looked exactly like what he was pretending to be, a quiet old man who had somehow wandered into the wrong party. Ruth met him at the door. She placed her hand on his arm, the way you guide an elderly relative, and she said, loud enough for the table to hear, "Everyone, this is Mr. William Porter. He's an old friend of Gray and Sons. He worked in construction many years ago. Mr. Porter, please, sit down." She led him to the far end of the table, the last seat, the one farthest from the head. Solomon, or rather, William, sat down quietly, placed his napkin in his lap, and said nothing. "Now listen, I'm going to tell you something that's going to make your blood boil." The first person to speak to him was Victor Langston, the vice president of operations. Victor was 52, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite, and a suit that probably cost $3,000. Victor was the leading candidate to replace Solomon. He was smart. He was aggressive. He closed deals like a machine. But there was something behind Victor's eyes that Solomon had never quite trusted. A coldness, like a room with no windows. Victor looked down the table at Solomon, gave him a quick glance, the kind of glance you give a parking meter, and turned back to the woman next to him without saying a word. Not hello, not welcome, not even a nod. The second board member, Patricia Howe, the chief financial officer, did acknowledge him. She smiled briefly and said, "Nice to meet you, Mr. Porter." The way you might say, nice weather to a stranger at a bus stop. Polite but empty, already looking away before the words were finished. The third, a man named Greg Chen, the head of business development, didn't even look in Solomon's direction. He was too busy showing the man next to him something on his phone, a photo of his new boat. Over the next 45 minutes, Solomon sat at the end of that table and watched. He watched, and he listened, and he remembered everything. That was another thing about Solomon. He never forgot a conversation.
He could tell you what someone said to him in 1987, word for word. It was a gift and a curse, because it meant he also remembered every insult, every slight, every cruel word that had ever been thrown at him. He just chose not to carry them as anger. He carried them as information. He watched Victor Langston order the most expensive wine on the menu, a $200 bottle, and then complain that it wasn't cold enough. He sent it back. When the waiter brought a new bottle, Victor didn't say thank you. He just waved his hand like he was shooing a fly. Solomon noted that. He watched Patricia Howe talk about her vacation home in the Bahamas for 12 straight minutes. She described the infinity pool. She described the view. She described the private beach. Not once did she ask anyone else at the table about their lives. Solomon noted that too. He watched Greg Chen interrupt two people mid-sentence because what he had to say was obviously more important. He watched Greg show photos of his new boat to anyone who would look. A 40-foot sailboat he had named The Closer because, as he explained 3 times, "That's what I do. I close deals." He laughed at his own joke every time. Nobody else did, but they smiled because Greg was on the board, and smiling at board members was a habit most people couldn't break. He watched Dennis Pratt order a second steak because the first one was too well done. He watched Dennis's wife, Evelyn, apply lipstick at the table and then examine her reflection in the back of a spoon. He watched a board member named Charles Fisher check his phone under the table 11 times in 30 minutes, Solomon counted, and respond to emails while the person next to him was mid-sentence. Nobody spoke to Solomon. Not really. A couple of people glanced his way and looked through him like he was made of glass, like he was part of the furniture. One man, Charles Fisher, made brief eye contact with Solomon, seemed to decide there was nothing to gain, and looked away before Solomon could even nod. One woman, Evelyn, Dennis Pratt's wife, leaned over to her husband at one point and whispered, loud enough for Solomon to hear, "Who is that old man at the end? He looks lost." Dennis shrugged and said, "Some retired worker Ruth dragged in. Just ignore him." Just ignore him. Those 3 words. Can you believe that? This man built every building those people worked in. He signed every paycheck they cashed. He created the chairs they were sitting in, and the table they were eating at, and the company name on their business cards. And they said, "Just ignore him." Solomon heard every word. He pushed his gold glasses up his nose. He folded his hands on the table. He said nothing. He sipped his water. And he waited. And that was only the beginning. Because there was one person at that table who was different, and her name was Clara. Clara Simmons was 31 years old. She was the youngest member of the board and the newest. She had been with Gray & Sons for only 3 years, working her way up from project manager to director of community development. She was a small woman, maybe 5'3", with dark brown skin and natural hair pulled back with a clip, and she wore a simple black dress that she had borrowed from her sister because she couldn't afford one of her own. Clara came from nothing. She grew up in a housing project in Durham, North Carolina. Her mother raised 4 children alone on a housekeeper's salary. Clara went to a state college on a scholarship, worked 2 jobs to pay for her books, and graduated at the top of her class. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's name, the janitor, the intern, the security guard at the front desk. When Clara arrived at the dinner, she walked past the sparkling suits and the expensive watches and the champagne glasses, and she went straight to the end of the table. She pulled out the chair next to Solomon, sat down and said, "Good evening, sir. I'm Clara Simmons. It's nice to meet you." Solomon looked at her. He pushed his glasses up. "Nice to meet you too, young lady. I'm William Porter." "Are you enjoying yourself, Mr. Porter?" Solomon paused. He looked down the long table at the loud conversations, the wine glasses, the people who hadn't looked at him once. Then he looked at Clara and said, "It's a little loud for my taste." Clara laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one. "Mine too, honestly. I'm more of a quiet dinner person myself." And for the next 2 hours, Clara talked to Solomon. Not because she thought he was important, not because she thought he could do something for her. She talked to him because he was a human being, sitting alone at a table,
and she was the kind of person who couldn't stand to see someone feel invisible. She asked him about his career in construction. Solomon, staying in character, told her about working with his hands, carrying lumber, pouring foundations. Clara's eyes lit up because she loved that kind of work. She told him about her projects at Gray & Sons, the affordable housing developments she was leading in underserved neighborhoods. She told him about a community center she was trying to get approved, but the board kept delaying the budget. "Why do they delay it?" Solomon asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it from her. Clara lowered her voice. "Because it doesn't make enough money. Some people on this board think every project should have a big profit margin. But some projects aren't about profit, they're about people." If you think that was bold, wait until you hear what Clara did next. The main course arrived: steak and roasted vegetables. As the plates were being set down, Victor Langston stood up and tapped his glass with a fork. The table went quiet. Victor looked like a man who enjoyed having a room's attention. He straightened his tie, a silk tie with a gold clip, and began to speak. "I just want to say a few words while we wait for Mr. Gray," Victor said. He smiled the way a shark smiles. "This company has done incredible things under Solomon Gray's leadership. But I think we all know that leadership evolves. The future of this company is about growth, expansion, new markets, bigger contracts. We need to be aggressive. We need to be bold. And frankly, we need to stop spending resources on projects that don't generate revenue." He looked directly at Clara when he said that last part. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. Victor continued. "I know some of us have a soft spot for community work. That's admirable. But this is a business, not a charity. And when I take on a larger role here, and I think we all see that coming, my priority will be profitability. Period." A few board members nodded. Greg Chen raised his glass. Patricia Howe clapped lightly. Dennis Pratt's wife whispered, "Now that's a leader." Solomon sat at the end of the table, quiet as a stone. He took off his glasses, cleaned them with his napkin, and put them back on. Then he turned to Clara, who was staring at her plate, her hands balled into fists under the table. "You all right?" he asked softly. Clara exhaled slowly. "That man wants to gut every community program we have. The housing project in East Charlotte, the mentorship program for young workers, the community center I've been fighting for. He thinks they're a waste of money." "And what do you think?" Solomon asked. Clara looked at him. Her eyes were fierce but sad. "I think a company that forgets where it came from is a company that doesn't deserve a future." Solomon felt something shift inside his chest, like a key turning in a lock. Because that was the exact same thing he believed. Word for word, line for line. But the real shock was still coming. After the main course, the conversation turned to gossip. Patricia Howe brought up the company's holiday party and whether the budget should be cut. Greg Chen made a joke about laying off the intern who kept burning the coffee. People laughed. Dennis Pratt told a story about a client who couldn't afford to pay and how he threatened to sue them. More laughter. Victor Langston leaned back in his chair and said, "You know what my father always told me? Don't waste your time on people who can't help you. Best advice I ever got." Solomon watched. Clara watched too. And then something happened that made Solomon's blood go cold. A waiter, a young man, maybe 22 or 23, with nervous hands and a fresh stain on his white shirt that he kept trying to cover with his arm, came to refill the water glasses. He started at the head of the table and worked his way down. His hands were steady at first, but by the time he reached the middle of the table, the loud voices and the expensive suits and the heavy atmosphere had gotten to him. Solomon could see it, the way the young man's shoulders were pulled up toward his ears, the way he held the water pitcher with both hands to keep it from shaking. When he reached Victor Langston, the young man tilted the pitcher carefully, but his hand trembled, just once, just slightly, and he spilled the small amount of water on the tablecloth. Not on Victor, not on his suit, not on his food, on the white tablecloth about 4 inches from Victor's plate. Maybe 2 tablespoons of water, a spot the size of a $50. Victor's face changed like a switch had been flipped. The smooth charm vanished,
The easy smile disappeared. What replaced it was something cold and hard and ugly. He looked at the young waiter the way you'd look at something stuck to the bottom of your shoe.
"Are you serious right now?" Victor said. His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. The whole table went quiet. "You can't even pour water? That's literally the simplest thing you could possibly do. What is wrong with you?" The young man's face went from nervous to terrified. Color rushed into his cheeks. His eyes widened. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm so sorry. I'll clean it up right away." "Sorry doesn't dry my table. Sorry doesn't fix incompetence. Get your manager. Now. I want to speak to your manager." The boy stood frozen. His hands were shaking so badly now that the pitcher trembled visibly. Solomon could see the boy's lower lip quivering. He was trying not to cry.
This boy, this young man working a Friday night shift in a restaurant to pay his bills, probably a student, probably exhausted, probably making minimum wage plus tips, was standing in front of 12 wealthy strangers being humiliated for spilling 2 tablespoons of water. The table was silent. A few people looked uncomfortable. Patricia Howe examined her fingernails. Greg Chen took a sip of wine. Dennis Pratt cleared his throat and said nothing. Charles Fisher glanced at his phone. Most of them looked at their plates. Nobody spoke up. Nobody said, "Victor, relax, it's just water." Nobody said, "It's fine, son, don't worry about it." Nobody defended that boy. Nobody except Clara. Clara set down her napkin, looked at Victor, and said, clear and steady, "Victor, it was 2 drops of water on a tablecloth. He's doing his job. Leave him alone." The silence at the table was so thick you could have cut it with one of those expensive steak knives. Victor stared at Clara like she had slapped him. "Excuse me?" Victor said. "You heard me," Clara said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "That young man is working on a Friday night to serve us dinner. The least we can do is treat him with basic decency." Victor laughed. A cold, ugly laugh. "Clara, maybe if you spent less time defending waiters and more time hitting revenue targets, you'd have a seat closer to the head of this table." A few people at the table snickered. Clara's face didn't change. She turned to the waiter, who was standing frozen beside the table, and said, "You're doing a great job, thank you." The young man nodded, his eyes wet, and moved quickly down the table. When he reached Solomon at the end, his hands were still shaking. Solomon looked up at him and said, quietly so only the boy could hear, "Don't let them shrink you, son. You're bigger than this room." The waiter looked at Solomon, and Solomon smiled at him. The boy blinked, nodded, and moved on. But what happened next changed the course of this entire story. At 9 o'clock, Ruth stood up from her seat near the middle of the table. She smoothed her blouse and cleared her throat. The table gradually fell quiet. "I have an announcement," Ruth said. She looked at Solomon. Solomon gave her the smallest nod. Ruth took a breath. "Some of you have been wondering when Mr. Gray would arrive tonight. I'm here to tell you that Mr. Gray has been here all evening." Confusion rippled down the table like a wave. People looked at each other. Victor frowned. Patricia tilted her head. Ruth turned and extended her hand toward the quiet old man at the end of the table. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. William Porter is Mr. Solomon Gray. He has been sitting among you all evening." The room went silent. Not the polite silence of waiting. Not the respectful silence of listening. The deep, airless, suffocating silence of people realizing they have made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The kind of silence that fills a room when the ground drops out from under you and you realize there is nothing to grab onto. Solomon stood up slowly. He took his time. He buttoned the top button of his plain white shirt. He adjusted his gold glasses on his nose. He smoothed the front of his trousers. And then he looked down the long table at every single face, one by one, person by person, the way a teacher looks at a classroom. Victor Langston's face went through 4 emotions in about 5 seconds: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked very much like fear. Deep, ice-cold fear. The kind you feel when you realize that the person you insulted, the person you ignored,
The person you dismissed as a nobody was the most powerful person in the room the entire time. Victor's mouth opened, his jaw moved, but no words came out.
He looked like a fish pulled from water. Patricia Howe set down her wine glass so fast it nearly tipped over. Her face lost its color. She pressed her hand to her chest and looked at Ruth as if hoping this was some kind of joke. Ruth's expression made it clear it was not. Greg Chen slowly put his phone away, the phone he had checked 11 times, and slid it into his pocket like it was evidence at a crime scene. His boat photos, his deal closing stories, his interruptions. All of it played back in his mind, and Solomon could see the realization hit him like a wave. Dennis Pratt went pale. His wife, Evelyn, the woman who had said, "Just ignore him," gripped the edge of the table with both hands. Her lipstick-perfect mouth was a thin, hard line. She looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Charles Fisher closed his eyes and pressed his fingers to his forehead. He was the one who had made eye contact with Solomon and looked away. He knew it. Solomon knew it, and now the whole room knew it. Solomon let the silence sit for 10 full seconds. He was not cruel about it. He did not gloat. He did not smile. He just stood there, a quiet man in a plain shirt, and let the weight of the moment do what moments like this always do: reveal the truth. Then Solomon spoke. His voice was not loud. It was never loud. Solomon had never needed to raise his voice in his life, because he had learned a long time ago that the people worth listening to are the ones you have to lean in to hear. And every person in that room leaned in. "I built this company with my hands," Solomon said. He held up those hands, thin, lined, scarred. The scar on his palm from a nail gun in 1983. The calluses from decades of work that had never fully smoothed out, even after he moved into an office. These hands carried lumber when I was 17 years old and didn't know what a contract was. These hands mixed cement in the Georgia heat until they bled. These hands signed the contracts that built this company into what it is today. And these same hands have shaken the hands of janitors and governors and waiters and senators and truck drivers and mayors with the exact same grip. Every single time. Because my mother taught me something when I was a boy living under a tin roof in Georgia. She said, "Solomon, every person you meet is carrying something heavy, something you can't see. Your job is to never make it heavier." I have lived by those words for 68 years. And tonight, I came here to find out if the people who want to lead my company live by them too. He paused. He looked at the empty water spot on the tablecloth near Victor's plate. Then he looked at Victor. "Tonight, I watched you belittle a young man for spilling 2 tablespoons of water on a tablecloth. A boy, because that's what he is, a boy, who was working on a Friday night to serve you food. A boy who was probably nervous because he was surrounded by people in suits that cost more than his monthly rent. You humiliated him, in front of 12 people. Not because he did something wrong, but because you could. Because you had the power, and he didn't. And you wanted everyone at this table to see that power. Well, I saw it. I saw exactly what that power looks like. And that told me everything I need to know about the kind of leader you would be." Victor's jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. His face was red above his collar. His knuckles were white on the edge of the table. He started to speak. His mouth opened, his chest lifted. But Solomon raised one hand. Gently, palm out, like a teacher asking for quiet. And Victor stopped. Because even in his fury, even in his humiliation, Victor knew that Solomon Gray had earned the right to speak, and he had not. Solomon looked around the table, at Patricia, at Greg, at Dennis and Evelyn, at Charles, at all of them. "I sat at this table for 2 hours tonight. 2 hours. And I was invisible to most of you. I understand. You didn't know who I was. But that is exactly my point.
That is the whole point of this evening. How you treat a man who can do nothing for you is the truest measure of who you are. Not how you treat your boss, not how you treat your clients, not how you treat the people who can promote you or pay you or open doors for you. How you treat the person who has nothing to offer. And tonight, most of you failed that test. He paused. He looked down at the table, then back up. But one person did not fail. He turned to Clara. Clara, who had sat beside him all night. Clara, who had asked his name and talked to him about buildings and communities and people. Clara, who had stood up to a powerful man to defend a waiter she had never met. Clara, who was sitting very still now with tears running silently down her cheeks.
Clara Simmons sat down next to an old man that nobody wanted to talk to and treated him like a human being. Not because she knew who I was. She didn't. She did it because that is who she is. And that, not revenue targets, not profit margins, not expansion plans, that is what this company was built on. That is what it will continue to be built on. Solomon looked at Ruth. Ruth nodded. Effective next month, Solomon said, I will be stepping back from day-to-day operations. And the person I am recommending to the full board as my successor, the next leader of Gray & Sons Construction, is Clara Simmons. The room erupted, not in applause, in shock. Victor stood up so fast his chair scraped backward on the floor. His face was white with fury. This is absurd, Victor said. His voice was tight and high, the voice of a man who has lost control and knows it. She's been here 3 years. 3 years. I have given this company 15 years of my life. I brought in the Davidson contract. I brought in the Meridian deal. I have generated more revenue for this company than anyone in this room. You can't pass me over for a community project manager who doesn't even own her own dress. The room went dead silent. You could hear the candles flickering on the table. You could hear the clock on the far wall ticking. Clara looked at Victor. She did not flinch. She did not look down. She did not blink. She looked at him the way a person looks at a storm they have already decided to walk through. Solomon said very quietly, almost gently, Victor, you just proved my point. In one sentence, you measured Clara's worth by the clothes on her back and the years on her resume, instead of the content of her character. That is exactly why this decision is the right one. Victor stood there for another moment, his chest heaving, his nostrils flared, his perfectly knotted silk tie suddenly looking like the most ridiculous thing in the room. His fists were clenched at his sides. He looked around the table, searching for an ally, searching for someone who would stand with him, someone who would say, Victor's right, this isn't fair. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Not Patricia, not Greg, not Dennis, not Charles. Every one of them was looking at their own hands, their own plates, their own reflections in the silverware, confronting their own performance that evening. Victor was alone, and there is nothing lonelier than being the loudest person in a silent room. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, pulled it on with sharp, angry movements, straightened his lapels out of habit, turned, and walked out of the restaurant. His leather shoes clicked on the marble floor like a countdown. His wife, Evelyn Pratt, Victor's wife, a woman named Sharon who had spent the evening talking about their house in Buckhead, hesitated. She looked at the table. She looked at Solomon. Something flickered across her face. Maybe embarrassment, maybe sadness, maybe just the cold realization that she had married a man who had just shown the whole room exactly who he was. Then she picked up her clutch and followed him. The heavy wooden door closed behind them with a sound like a book slamming shut. The room was still. Solomon exhaled. Ruth was standing near the wall, her arms crossed, her eyes glistening. She had watched this whole thing unfold. She had known it would come to this. She knew Solomon better than anyone except Nadine. Solomon turned back to Clara. She was still sitting in her chair, tears streaming quietly down her face, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone ashy. She looked like a woman who had been picked up by a wave and set down in a place she never imagined she'd be. "Mr. Gray," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready for this."
Solomon sat back down beside her.
He took off his glasses and looked at her with his bare eyes. Dark brown, steady, warm.
Clara, nobody is ever ready. I wasn't ready when I started this company with a truck and 2 workers and a prayer. My mother wasn't ready when she raised 3 children on a housekeeper's pay. Ready is not a thing you are. It's a thing you become. And you are already becoming it. Clara closed her eyes. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then she opened her eyes and said, "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Solomon said. "Because you don't do things for me. You do them for the people who nobody else sees. And that is the kind of leader the world needs." But this story is far from over. Because what happened in the weeks and months after that dinner changed everything for more people than just Clara. The morning after the dinner, Clara drove to the office before sunrise.
She sat in the parking lot in her car, a 7-year-old Honda Civic with a scratch on the passenger door, and stared at the building. Gray & Sons Construction. Her building now. Or it would be soon. She gripped the steering wheel and whispered to herself, "You can do this. You can do this." Then she took a breath, grabbed her bag, and went inside. The first thing she did when she officially stepped into her new role, the very first item on her very first day, was approve the community center project that the board had been delaying for 2 years. She called the budget meeting herself. She sat at the head of the conference table, the same table where she used to sit in the corner taking notes, and she said, "This project is not optional. This is who we are. We break ground in January." Nobody argued. Not anymore. She broke ground on a freezing morning in January, standing in an empty lot in East Charlotte that was covered in brown weeds and broken bottles. She wore a hard hat that was slightly too big for her head. It kept slipping forward, and she held a shovel in both hands. 50 people from the neighborhood came out to watch, even though the wind was biting and the sky was the color of old cement. Some of them brought lawn chairs. Some of them brought thermoses of coffee. Some brought their children, bundled up in coats and scarves, with their little noses red from the cold. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, with a gap-toothed smile and a puffy blue jacket that was zipped all the way up to his chin, separated from his grandmother and walked right up to Clara. He tugged on her sleeve with his small gloved hand. "Are you building something?" he asked. His breath came out in little white clouds. Clara knelt down to his level. The frozen ground was hard under her knee. "Yes, sir, we are." "What is it?" "It's a place where people in your neighborhood can come to learn things and play games and read books and be together. A place that belongs to everyone." The boy thought about this for a second. He looked at the empty lot. He looked at the shovel. He looked at Clara. Then he said, "Can I help?" Clara smiled so wide her eyes crinkled at the corners. "You already are, sweetheart. You're here, and being here matters more than you know." That boy's name was Jalen, and he became a part of this story in a way nobody expected. Jalen came back to that construction site every single Saturday with his grandmother, a stout woman named Diane who wore a green coat and carried butterscotch candies in her pocket. They would stand at the chain-link fence and watch. Jalen watched the foundation get poured. He watched the steel beams go up. He watched the walls rise from the dirt like something growing. He watched the roof go on, sheet by sheet. He watched the windows get installed, big windows that let in light, because Clara had insisted on big windows. "People need light," she told the architect. "That's not negotiable." Every Saturday, Jalen asked the workers questions. "What's that tool called? How come the concrete is wet? Can I hold that hammer?" The workers, most of them big men in hard hats and dusty boots, would kneel down and explain things to him with the patience of teachers. One worker, a man named Douglas who had been with Gray & Sons for 22 years, started bringing an extra pair of safety glasses for Jalen. Too big for his face, of course. They slid down his nose. But Jalen wore them like they were made of gold. Jalen told his grandmother Diane one Saturday in March, standing at the fence in a light rain, watching Douglas bolt a doorframe into place. "Grandma, I want to build things when I grow up. Big things. Like this." Diane told Clara about this on a rainy afternoon in March, standing under an umbrella at the edge of the lot,
her voice cracking. Clara had to turn away so nobody would see her cry, because she understood.
She understood what it meant for a little boy from this neighborhood to look at a building going up and see himself in it, to see a future, to see a door that was open instead of closed. The community center opened in June. They named it the Nadine Gray Community Center after Solomon's wife. When Solomon saw the sign above the door, Nadine Gray Community Center in bronze letters, he stood on the sidewalk for a long time, pushing his glasses up his nose again and again, his eyes shining behind the lenses. Ruth stood beside him, holding her coffee mug, saying nothing. Some moments don't need words. Victor Langston resigned from the board 2 weeks after the dinner. He took a position at a competing firm in Houston. Solomon heard through the grapevine that Victor was already making enemies there too, barking at assistants, cutting corners, treating people like furniture. Some people never learn. And that is a kind of poverty that no amount of money can fix. Greg Chen stayed on the board but became a different person after that night. Something about watching Solomon stand up had humbled him. He stopped showing off his boat. He started showing up to job sites and learning the names of the workers. He told Clara once, quietly, over coffee, "I was one of the people who didn't see him. I looked right through him. I'll never do that again." And to his credit, he didn't. Patricia Howe retired the following year. At her farewell dinner, a much quieter affair, she pulled Clara aside and said, "He was right. I spent 20 years climbing a ladder and forgot to look at the people holding it up." Clara hugged her, because that is what Clara did. She didn't hold grudges. She held people. As for Solomon, he kept his house. He kept his magnolia tree. He kept Nadine's favorite reading chair in the corner of the living room, even though nobody sat in it. He kept polishing his brown shoes every Sunday night. And every Tuesday, he drove to the community center and sat in the back during the after-school program, watching children do homework and play checkers and argue about whose turn it was on the computer. He never announced himself. He just sat in a plastic chair with a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, the way he always drank it, and watched. One afternoon, little Jalen, the boy from the groundbreaking, saw Solomon sitting in his usual chair and walked over. He was 7 now, still had the gap-toothed smile, still wore the puffy blue jacket even though it was getting too small. "Hey, mister," Jalen said. "Are you somebody's grandpa?" Solomon smiled. Not officially. Jalen climbed into the chair next to him, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You come here a lot." "I do." "How come?" Solomon thought about it. He pushed his glasses up. He looked at the room full of children and tutors and laughter and noise. "Because this is where the important people are," Solomon said. Jalen looked around the room. He looked at the kids arguing over the computer. He looked at the girl doing math homework with her tongue sticking out. He looked at the tutor helping a boy sound out a word. Then Jalen looked back at Solomon and said, "But mister, those are just kids." Solomon nodded. "Exactly." Jalen squinted at him, like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. Then he shrugged and said, "You're kind of weird, but I like you." And he patted Solomon on the knee, hopped off the chair, and ran back to his friends. Solomon laughed. A real laugh. The kind that starts somewhere deep and fills up the whole chest. The kind he hadn't laughed since Nadine was alive. Ruth, who was standing near the door because she always seemed to be nearby, heard that laugh and smiled to herself and sipped her coffee. Clara came by the community center that same evening. She was still in her work clothes, a blazer and slacks now, not a borrowed dress, and she had a folder under her arm and circles under her eyes because she'd been working 16-hour days. She found Solomon in his plastic chair and sat down next to him. "Long day?" he asked. "Every day is a long day, but a good one." She set the folder down. "I approved 3 new community projects today. Housing rehab in West Charlotte, a job training program in partnership with the community college, and a scholarship fund for construction workers' children." Solomon nodded slowly. Nadine would have liked that. "I hope so. I wish I could have met her." "She would have loved you," Solomon said. and he meant it. They sat in silence for a moment. The room was emptying out. Children were leaving with parents and grandparents, zipping up jackets, waving goodbye. The fluorescent lights hummed. Clara said, "Mr. Gray, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That night at the dinner, when you were sitting at the end of the table and nobody talked to you, were you angry?"
Solomon considered this. He took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, the way he always did when he was thinking hard. "No," he said. "I wasn't angry. I was sad. Because I remembered being invisible for real. When I was young, nobody saw me because I was poor and black and small. I built this company so that people like me would be seen. And when I sat at that table and watched my own board members ignore a quiet old man, I realized that success doesn't change people. It reveals them." Clara let that settle. Then she said, "Thank you for seeing me." Solomon put his glasses back on. He looked at her. "Clara, I didn't see you. You made yourself visible. There's a difference. You walked to the end of that table. You sat down. You spoke. You stood up for a stranger. Nobody asked you to do any of that. You just did it because it was right. And that is not something I gave you.
"That is something you already had." Clara nodded. She picked up her folder. She stood up. And then she did something that surprised Solomon. She leaned down and kissed him on the top of his white-haired head, the way a daughter would. "Good night, Mr. Gray." "Good night, Clara." She walked out the door and into the evening. The sky was turning purple at the edges. The streetlights were coming on. Solomon could hear children in the distance, playing somewhere, their voices carrying through the air like music. Solomon sat in his plastic chair for a few more minutes. The community center was quiet now. The lights were still on. The chairs were empty. But the room still felt full somehow. Full of all the children who had been there. Full of all the laughter and arguing and homework and questions. Full of Jalen's gap-toothed grin. Full of the tutor who stayed an extra hour because a little girl needed help with long division. Full of the grandmother who dropped off homemade cookies every Wednesday because she wanted the kids to have a treat. Full of all the invisible, ordinary, extraordinary kindness that happens in rooms like this, every day, in every city, when nobody important is watching. Full of the future. Solomon finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup in the small kitchen. Even though the janitor would have done it, Solomon always washed his own cup, because that's who he was, and set it upside down on the drying rack. He stood up slowly, feeling the ache in his knees that had been there for 20 years, pushed in his plastic chair, and walked to the front door. Before he left, he stopped and looked at the bronze sign above the entrance. Nadine Gray Community Center. He reached up and touched the letters with the tips of his fingers. The metal was cold. The letters were smooth. He traced the N and the G and the C the way a man traces the face of someone he loves in a photograph. "I think they turned out all right, Nadine," he said quietly, to no one and to everyone. "I think they turned out just fine." Then he pushed his glasses up one more time, put his hands in his pockets, and walked to his car. A quiet man, in a plain white shirt, in brown leather shoes he polished every Sunday, worth $47 million, and worth so much more than that. Because the truth is, the measure of a person is not what they have. It is not the wine they order, or the suit they wear, or the car they drive, or the title on their business card. The measure of a person is what they do when nobody is watching. How they treat the waiter, how they speak to the stranger. Whether they sit at the end of the table with the old man nobody notices, or whether they look through him like glass. Solomon Gray knew that. He had always known that. And now, so did everyone else. That's the end of today's story, but the lessons last forever. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and tell us in the comments, which character reminded you of someone in your own life? See you soon.